Hello everybody and welcome back to our game engines lecture for this unit. So in the previous video I showed you how to install Ogre 3D, and the steps that we took were fairly straightforward. We effectively downloaded and installed the appropriate SDK for Ogre 3D to use for Visual Studio 2012 or Visual Studio 2013. And then we just extract it. It's basically a zip file, a compressed file. We extracted the files and we placed them in the in a folder that was convenient for us. Then we created an environment variable to point to that folder, and so now we're ready to actually go ahead and start implementing our first application. And in this video, all I want to do is to set the application up and in Visual Studio. I'll show you in Visual Studio 2013. Once it is set up, then we'll go and we'll take 3 steps to implement our Ogre program that effectively just shows a mesh in the screen with just a simple light on. All right, so these are the steps that we will have to take to set up our first project and first Ogre application in Visual Studio. It is a C++ project, so we were going to go ahead and create a project, and we're going to make it a console application and an empty project so that we could add only the libraries and dependencies we need. And then we're going to add a main file, and then we're going to set our project properties. So let's go ahead and start working on it. So the first thing to do is to create our project. And again, as I said, we're going to make this a console application and make it an empty project. So here we are in the Visual Studio. I'm going to use Visual Studio 2013 for this development, but the steps should be fairly straightforward and similar if you were to use Visual Studio 2012 or even 2010. The only thing that you need to make sure is that you would use the correct SDKs for your project. So we're going to go ahead, File, and Create New, and create a new project. And then obviously I want it to be a Visual Studio project, and I want it to be a Win32 application. And you can do Win32 project or Win32 console application. I'm going to go ahead and use the console application, and let's call this first Ogre project. Then we're going to go ahead and click Next. And we want to make sure that it is a console application, and we want it to be empty projects. So I don't want to put up with a precompiled header or anything like that. I want it to be just a straightforward empty project that I can add the things that I need to add, and only the things that I want to add into this project. Go ahead and click Finish, and then your project will be set up. Let's give you a quick tour of what you're going to see here. Obviously, if you've developed with Visual Studio, you should have no problem. All of this should be completely familiar to you. If not, I strongly recommend you go ahead and get yourself familiar with different windows and different environments that you have. To the left, we would have our Solution Explorer. The Solution Explorer is where our project resources are. Our source files, our dependencies, our header files, and all sorts of things. And then the development part, the text editor, is going to be this big window in front of you here in the middle. That's where you type in your code. Obviously, there's nothing there, so it should be disabled. And then the output, where you get your, if you have any kind of errors, you would see them down here. And obviously, we already covered these in the first 3 units, so you should be familiar with these concepts. The next thing that I need to do is to go ahead and add a source file. I'll add a main file to my project here, and I'll make it a CPP file. And then we're going to go ahead and set up the properties of our project. So in order to add a file, you can either go to File and then go to Add, well, actually, New. So File, New, and then you will be able to add a file there. Or alternatively, right-click somewhere in the Solution Explorer and then go to the Add from the pop-up menu, and then click on Add New Item. When you go there, then Wizard opens up, and then you can choose the C++ file. I want to add a source file, and let's call it main ogre. And then click on Add. And this will add your source file to your project. Now, here's where you usually do your includes, this and that, using namespaces, and then your void main or your int main function goes in there. We're not going to go there yet. So before we go and add our code here, we will have to go ahead and set up our project properties. So the things that I need to take care of setting up my project properties are include the additional paths that Ogre uses, so I can point to objects and functionalities from Ogre. Then add my additional library paths where the Ogre and Boost libraries are, and then our dependencies, which are going to be in the form of static lib files, and then point to the correct binaries location so that my project, the executables, are accessible when I run my project. And the executables and the dynamically linked libraries, or the DLL files that I would be interested in, is going to be in a location which is basically your bin folder. All right, to set up your project properties, right-click on your project, just simply where you added the files. Now this time we're going to click on the Properties tab. So the Properties tab is going to be the last item from the pop-up menu that shows up. And you click on it, and then it opens up your project's property. And basically everything, all these tabs may be collapsed, or some of them may be opened, but don't worry about it. I'll point you to where we want to actually work and develop. We're not going to deal with the configuration manager, at least for this class. All of the stuff that we're going to do is going to be in the debug mode, so our active configuration is debug, and we're fine. And the active platform that we're going to use is Win32, since I wanted to have a platform where the majority of the students would have access to, so then the older OS systems will also work with. So we're going to stick with Win32, and in fact the SDK I gave you are 32-bit SDKs. If you wanted to develop Win64 or for the 64-bit applications, you would have to use the 64-bit editions. So the first item that we need to go and add, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be your include folders, or the include directories. To do that, click on the C++, or rather C++ tab, and that opens up your C++ section where you can add your additional using directories, additional include directories, debug information format. And so at this point, what we are interested in is adding our additional include directories. Now, there's actually two ways to do this. The first way is to basically add the actual location of our directories, or rather where the path to the .h files for the Ogre SDK are. Just type it all in. And it's not too bad, actually. When you type in, the autocomplete basically shows you the directories, and then you can actually go through and add them. I'm going to do that just once, just to show you how tedious it is. And the second way of doing and adding your additional include libraries is actually to utilize that environment variable that we set up earlier. Now, if you don't remember what the environment variable was, I'm just going to quickly go ahead and show you. Go ahead and click my computer, open it up, right-click, and then Properties, and then you would see Advanced Settings and Environment Variable. Now, if you notice, I added these environment variables last week, and I called them Ogre Home _ VC11, Ogre _ Home _ VC12. These were the folders, or rather environment variables that I created. And if you look at these, basically they point to the actual location. So they were, if you remember when we were installing, I installed them on my C drive, gaming programs, Ogre 1.9, Ogre SDK VC12. So that's the location for where my library is, and I call it VC12 Ogre Home. And this is what I use with Visual Studio 2013. If you wanted to do for Visual Studio 2012, you would have to go to the correct SDK. So these are the environment variables that I have created. So let's just drag them out of the way for now. And let's go back to our additional include libraries. So, so then again, we want to add our include libraries here. So when you click in front of the additional include libraries, a little triangle drop-down pops open. Click on it, and then go to Edit. Now, in here, you can add your additional folder locations. When you click on New Line, then you will be able to type in C: gaming programs, if you remember, Ogre 1.9, Ogre SDK 2012, and then include. So that's one way to include your files. But as you see, for every single one of them, I have to actually type in the whole folder location. Alternatively, delete this. Use the environment variable. Now remember, I called my environment variable ogre_home_vc12. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just simply use that name in order to add my library. So to do that, you basically put in the ogre_home_vc12 in $parentheses sign, and then include. So that would include my Ogre directory. So this, when you're running your project, your Visual Studio will take this environment variable $ogre_home $parentheses ogre_home_vc12 and replaces it with the actual value for it, which was basically the location. Then again, just so you remember it, so this ogre_home_vc12 in $parentheses is going to translate into the actual location of my object or my folder. Okay, so that includes my main directory. So let's see what the location for that directory is. Alternatively, you can actually click on Browse, and then you'll be able to actually browse for it. So I want to go again in C /gaming programs Ogre 1.9 SDK 12 include. So so you can also use the browse folder to include your folders, your additional folders there. So that's the main Ogre. Visual Studio 2010 and 12 version, 12 and 13 version of the Ogre SDK use something called overlay. So you will also need to add that location. So that's actually a simple one too. So ogre_home_vc12 /include /overlay. So this should also, actually I think it's in /include /ogre /overlay. This should also add the overlay library that we need. Actually, the base application of the Ogre uses this library. And also I need to add my boost. So if you go to Ogre SDK folder, you will see these libraries in, and if you remember, so this is the include library, and then so we included that, and then the ogre_overlay. And if you go to the main folder for your SDK, you will see that it also has a boost location for your boost libraries. So now back in our additional include directories wizard, we're gonna go and create a new line, And then again, we're going to type ogre home vc12 backslash, and this time we're going to use the boost directory within the Ogre SDK. So it's already included. If you have Boost installed and it's in some other location, you can also use that location. But since I already put and included the Boost with the Ogre libraries, with the Ogre SDK, when you download it, it should be already there, so you directly can point to it. Now this wraps up adding our additional include directories in our project properties. So then we can just click OK and click Apply. So that takes care of adding our Ogre, adding the Ogre overlays, and then adding the Boost folders. Then we're going to go and add our library paths, or our lib paths. Now, that is going to be in the Linker tab of your project properties. So click on the Linker tab. We're done with the CC++. And Linker basically is where, let me actually close this and reopen it. So when we go to the Linker tab, that's where, under the general subcategory, that's where the library dependencies are going to be outlined for us. And we are interested in the additional library directories. Just like additional include directories, here's where we put the locations where our lib files are. So click on Edit again. And then again, you can click on New Line, and you can either type in directly, or alternatively, we basically use our ogre underscore home underscore vc12 to point us where our libraries are. Now, this lib files are just a little bit tricky, and because we have two different versions. We have the debug versions and we have the release versions. I'm going to go back again in the Ogre SDK directory structure, and so the library folders are going to be under the lib tab, lib folder. And so in the lib folder, if you remember from last time, we have a bunch of folders, the debug and the release. So what I'm going to be interested in is actually in the debug version of them, because I'm going to be in the debug mode majority of the time for my development. So in order to add those, we're going to go to from the Ogre home, we're going to go to the lib and then debug. And that's for my debug tab. My debug lib of the Ogre. Boost is a little bit different, so we go back to the main folder, and so in the Boost tab, I already have the lib folder directly there. So I'm going to add that in my folders. Again, it's going to be $ parentheses Ogre home vc12 backslash boost backslash lib. And this adds my library folders to the path for the linker to be able to resolve. Now, that's just for the folders. There's a problem. If you were to stop here and go ahead and write your program, it will compile, but it won't link, because although we pointed out the locations where the library files are, we haven't specified which files we want to use as inputs to our linker. So the next section is to go under the Input tab and then add our additional dependencies, which are going to be a bunch of lib files that we're going to use. We are going to actually use 2 lib files, and I'm going to show you those lib files directly. So when you go on your libraries for your Ogre under the debug mode, these are the lib files we're going to use. Ogre underscore main, Ogre main underscore D, and then Ogre input output system, or OIS underscore D. So if you wanted to also add other things, for example, volumes, terrains, and other properties, you would also need to add those libraries also as additional dependencies. But these are the 2 dependencies that we'll be mainly interested in, Ogre main and OIS. Notice the libraries in the debug version, they have an underscore D at the end. So you want to actually add the full name as it is. If you were to use the release versions are exactly the same thing, but they don't have the underscore D. So we're going to go and add these two files to our dependencies. So click on the additional dependencies drop-down bar, click on edit, and then you'll be able to edit those names. And usually what I'll do is I'll just basically bring this folder so that I can spell the values directly. So the first one is ogre main underscore d. So it's going to be ogre main underscore d.lib. And then the next one, if you remember it, it was called ois underscore d. So ois underscore d.lib. If you misspell these names, then you're going to get an unresolved external runtime error. And when that happens, then you will know that, or rather link error. And when that happens, you would know that there's either something wrong with your folders, or there's something wrong with the name of your library files that you typed in. Alternatively, you can actually go in here from the window explorer and just open the name of the file in the rename mode, and then copy and paste it. So that's fine. So we added our additional dependencies in the form of our underscore d .lib files for ogre main and then OIS. So this is fantastic. So we created our project, and we have set it up, and we have set up the additional include paths. We have added the additional lib paths and for ogre and boost. And then we added our libraries and dependencies. And so those dependencies were ogre main underscore d.lib and ogre is, or rather ois underscore d.lib. The final thing we can do before we can actually compile and execute our first application is to add our working directories to the path too. The reason is that when you are actually building your code and linking it at the compile time, your compiler goes through those header files and finds the proper header functions that basically gives you access to all of the classes that are in the Ogre SDK to program against. Once that is done, the linker goes into your link folders, which we added, and that was the ogre lib debug and then boost lib locations, and looks for the objects, or rather the static library functionalities, which are binaries basically. And so at the link time, those will be resolved. So once that is created, then the executable files would require to have the dynamically linked libraries to be able to link to at the runtime. And so that is where we need to basically point to. So we have to find where the DLL files of Ogre are, which actually is in this bin folder. And once we find those, then we will be able to actually click, or rather add that location as our working directory, so that at runtime we will have access to those DLLs. If you don't want to do that, you need to go ahead and copy the DLL files from that bin folder, and then copy them and paste them inside of your own project. So where are they? Those DLL files are in the bin folder here, and then there are in the debug section of it, which is basically kind of like the equivalent of the static libraries that you had. So if you remember, your static libraries were under the lib debug, and then you have those objects there, and then the dynamic ones are actually bin debug. And so, so for example, the ogre main DLL that we use, and then the OIS DLL that we need to use at the runtime, those are going to be on the bin folder. So let's go back to our Visual Studio, and this time we're going to go under the debugging tab. So under the debugging tab, you would see that your working directory right now is your project directory. So where is it? It's basically the project file. So it's somewhere under your documents, and then Visual Studio 2013 projects, blah blah. So that's where your working directory is. But I'm not interested in my working directory. I would like to point to where these DLL files are. So those DLL files are effectively, if you remember, are under my ogre underscore home underscore vc12 folder, and then bin, and then debug, right? So that's where they are. So this Ogre SDK, which is the path to my Ogre home, and then bin folder inside of it, and then the debug folder inside of it, and that gives me to the location where my libraries are. Apply, OK, and now our project is completely set up for us to start our first Ogre program. I think I'm going to effectively finish this part of this lecture here, and then we're going to go to the next video. And in the next video, which is basically the third video in this series, you'll be able to see our first project and building. Yeah, let's start our project and type in code in the next video.